Good morning, everyone. In today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the type of information you need to be considering when you're developing a seed mix for conservation practice. I want to remind everyone that this webinar is one of 6 in a series that describes the seeding process. It was developed with the new conservation planner in mind, but hopefully if you've been doing seeding for a while, you'll still find information in this webinar and in this series useful. I do want to mention that it does work together as a unit, so sometimes we're referring to information that was presented in a previous webinar, and it's meant to build on each other. So I would encourage you to watch all of the webinars in a series. In the previous webinar on planning a seeding, we focused on steps 1 through 4 listed here. And today we're going to briefly revisit how information on resource concerns, objectives, and site inventory are used when planning a seeding. And we're going to discuss some of the common mistakes that can be made in hopes that it'll help you avoid pitfalls when you're using that information to design a seed mix. And then we're going to discuss the seed attributes that you might consider when designing or developing a seed mix, such as the plant characteristics, the seed cost, and other information. And we're going to review where you can find this plant material information that you're going to need for designing the seed mix. And finally, we're going to walk through a couple seed mix examples. So the seed mix is going to be designed using the information you gathered in the planning phase of the project, including information on resource concerns and landowner objectives and site characteristics. And these are topics we discussed in the previous webinar. There's a lot of different resource concerns you might have on a site. For example, there might be plant community structure concerns or wind erosion or terrestrial habitat that you might want to improve for wildlife. Similarly, a site might have multiple objectives, and there could be one of many. For example, you might have forage production or habitat improvement as an objective. But hopefully at this point of the planning, you're starting to think about the plant characteristics that will address those concerns. For example, when you hear the word wind erosion as a concern, you might start thinking about species that you can use that are going to be able to hold the soil and prevent erosion. Species that are fast establishing, that might have a robust root system, maybe also good above ground biomass, so you're going to be protecting the soil surface. And when you know that forage production is an objective, you might also start thinking about plants that have characteristics such as being palatable species that might be nutritious or able to tolerate grazing. And always remember that the species you select need to be compatible with the site and the site conditions. We're going to start out just by talking about a few common mistakes that can be made when you're putting in a seeding. And we use these because they're good learning examples, and we learn from these experiences and hopefully don't repeat them in the future. But it's a good quick look at why site conditions and the objectives are so important and how they dictate and really influence the species that you're selecting when you're developing a mix. So one of those common mistakes is that we might pick a species for the mix that isn't expected to thrive in the environment where it's planted. For example, a seed mix that contains species that require more precipitation than the site can provide. And one example of this might be planting orchard grass in an arid rangeland setting for improving forage. Now, orchard grass is an introduced species and it's used for forage production, but its area of adaptation is a minimum precip range of about 16 inches. And for cultivars, this means that the minimum precip range is where that cultivar is going to be well adapted rather than being marginally adapted. And so it can make the difference between a plant really thriving on a site versus it just surviving on the site. And this is another example of picking a species that might not be appropriate for not just a precip zone, but the soil moisture and the moisture profile. And this is a picture of showy milkweed, and we seeded it on a site where they wanted to improve the monarch butterfly habitat. And milkweed was present throughout the property. But what was really important for this species is that it needed to be seeded at the right soil moisture level. So it needed to have a little bit higher water table. And the site that was selected for seeding was really just too dry. And so you can see in this photo, it was able to establish from seed, but it's very stressed out. And it's also having to compete with a lot of weeds on the site. Another common mistake is selecting a species that's not adapted to the project's soils. And it's also important to check that the soils that you know, not only know the soils of the property, but you know if there's inclusions of different soils present within that area. And we need to take that into consideration when developing a seed mix. And the example I'll use here is a saline or salt affected site. And we might have some salt affected sites within a larger area that we're planting. And you really need to know if those sites are present so that you can include species that'll either do well in those salt affected sites, or maybe you want to also develop a second seed mix that you'll seed only in the salt affected sites, and make sure you can pick species that are well adapted to the electrical conductivity levels of that soil. Another common mistake I've seen as part of the site inventory and objectives, that we really want to look at how the site is managed, both currently and into the future. For example, if an area had broadleaf perennial weeds and you know or think it might be managed in the future with a broadleaf herbicide, we need to know that as we're going into designing the seed mix. And this is an example of a site where there was spotted knapweed present. So it was a perennial broadleaf weed, a forb. And when the seed mix was designed, it included both forbs and grasses. And after the seeding application, the site was sprayed again for weeds. And so it removed some of the seedling grasses, but more importantly, it removed almost all of the forbs from the site. The few forbs that remain on the site really represent hundreds of dollars worth of seed that was used and then terminated on the site by the herbicide. So it really speaks to the importance of knowing not only what the current management is, but what the follow-up management is going to be on a site when you're developing a seed mix. Another common mistake that can be made is planting palatable species with species that are not palatable. This can lead to overuse of the real palatable species and underuse of the other less desired species, depending on what your grazing strategy is going to be. Another common mistake might be planting species that aren't suitable for the planned season of use. And again, this can lead to early pasture degradation or low quality forage on the site. And it's a good example of why you need to be really specific when you're talking with your landowners about what their objectives are on the site, how they're going to use that site year to year or season to season as you're developing the seed mix. The last common mistake I'll bring up is just an example related to the costs and how it's important to think about what the costs are in a site and what the short-term cost savings might mean to the longer-term objectives of the site. And this is an example of a field that was enrolled in the CRP program where it was seeded with an inexpensive, low-diversity seed mix in the past. And now we're seeing that these fields really miss the opportunity to re-enroll in the CRP program due to the lack of species diversity on the site. And a more appropriate seed mix might have been one that cost more initially, but it would be more a diverse seed mix, and that diverse design might be able to meet the management objectives and the program objectives well into the future. So it's important to think about our objectives in the time frame of the project and the time frame of the planting, not just the short term, but also in the long term. So as we're designing and developing our seed mixes, we want to make sure that the seed mix is going to address the resource concerns, the site inventory, and the objectives. And we pick plants that have characteristics to address all of those. In the last PowerPoint, we also talked a lot about picking the plant species that have the characteristics to address our resource concerns. And hopefully you've been thinking about what plant species characteristics are needed if you have specific resource concerns or objectives. For example, if you have a site like this one, it's a recent burn. We know that there's some weeds in the area. There's some areas that are prone to erosion. So you should be thinking, like, what characteristics do I need on this site? Okay, I need a species that's going to grow fast, be relatively easy to establish, to compete with the weeds, and also to hold the soil. You might also be thinking about having a diversity of plants to compete with the weeds. If you're looking at a site that you want to increase the abundance of forage, you should also be thinking about species that, again, produce a lot of above ground biomass, and that it's going to be nutritious and digestible species for your livestock. So as a new conservation planner, I really encourage you to practice being a good observer when you're in the field and look at species that are present on the site and think about what their characteristics are contributing, not just to the site, but also to the management. And it's going to help you become more familiar with species and their characteristics. And you're also going to get a sense of where you're going to find them on the landscape. So let's switch gears now and start talking about other characteristics you want to think about when you're developing a seed mix. And some of those are considering the life cycle of the plant, the species origin, the growth habits of the plant species, and also the seed characteristics. And we're going to talk about each one of these. So first of all, the life cycle of a plant. So a life cycle is a period of time that it takes from the germination of that seed to the production of seed or the completion of the reproductive life cycle of that plant. And generally we plant either annuals, short-lived perennials, or long-lived perennials in our seed mixes. And we generally include these in the seed mix for different reasons. So an annual that you might plant on the site would be annual ryegrass or triticale. Some reasons for using it is that you might have an irrigated site and you know that you're going to harvest it after one growing season. You might be using that annual species to prepare the site for future longer-lived plants. Using an annual crop might be a good way to control the weeds in that site before planting longer-lived species. And you also might include it as a way to control erosion, develop a plant that establishes quick to prevent erosion. So short-lived species, perennial species that we might include on the site would be species like slender wheatgrass. It can be used to stabilize a site, and it can also be used as a nurse crop for longer-lived plants. But generally, what we're most commonly seeding on a site is the long-lived perennials. And we're using these on dryland sites, rangeland sites, and also irrigated pastures. And they provide the forage production that we'd like to see on a site. And also they're considered late successional stage plants, and they're more stable in the community, so there's less changeover in species. The short-lived plants, like the annuals and the short-lived perennials, generally establish faster on the site than the long-lived plants. and including them in a seed mix can be beneficial, but a lot of times we want to limit the amount of, say, a short-lived perennial if we add it in a seed mix, because it can start to compete with some of the longer-lived species that we're trying to establish. Another consideration when developing our seed mix is to think about the origin of the species that we're seeding. So a native species is a plant that has developed over hundreds of thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And we're usually looking for species not just adapted to North America, but to Montana and Wyoming specifically. And then an introduced species is a plant that has been, with the help of humans, intentionally introduced to a species, and it's been selected to be brought to a similar climatic zone, usually within the same northern hemisphere latitude, and it's been selected for certain qualities that that plant has, like its biomass production or its nutritional value. And there's been a debate over whether to use native or introduced species for conservation practices over the last couple decades. And so I just want to go over a few of the pros and cons of using each of them. First of all, both of them are going to be well adapted to the environment that we're going to be planting them in, because the introduced species have been selected to be adapted to these climates, and we know our native species have evolved in these sites. Native species are well adapted to function as part of our native plant community, where some of our introduced species can tend to form monocultures, or they might limit the diversity out in the site. They might also inhibit the establishment of our native species. I would also say that some of our native species, and these are some real generalizations now, but some of our native species may not compete as well with our introduced weeds or our noxious weeds on the site. And this is because some of them establish quite slowly. I will say that there are some native species that can be quite competitive, but this is a generalization again, where our introduced species can tend to be a little bit more competitive with introduced weeds and noxious weeds because they're typically faster to establish on a site. Some other concerns about introduced species, we need to be concerned about them spreading to non-target areas. So we need to make sure we understand what the objectives are on the site and maybe beyond the site. So whether you choose native or introduced species is really going to depend on a lot of different factors, but it's really going to come down to what are the landowner objectives and what are the environmental conditions on the site. I will note that if you're working with another federal agency, you might be restricted to only using native species on the site. So just be aware of that as you're developing a seeding. We can combine native and introduced species together in a planting, but we need to use some precautions and tailor our seed mix when we do that, because the introduced species can be very competitive and they might outcompete some of our native plants. And here's a couple examples of that. This is a seeding that was done in western Montana. It was done for upland bird habitat. And as part of that seed mix, we used introduced species tall wheatgrass, which establishes quite quickly and does well on the site. And we combined the tall wheatgrass with some of our native grasses and native forbs. And really in the seed mix, we added too much of it as a proportion of our seed mix, and it really just dominated the site and formed almost a monoculture. So we can adjust our seeding rate or the proportion of introduced species in a mix in order for the species to be more compatible. So on this example on the right, this is a rangeland setting in central Montana, and we've seeded in rows of blue bunch wheatgrass and western wheatgrass, and you can see that they're establishing here. And we also added alfalfa to the mix. But we knew since alfalfa establishes really well as an introduced species, we limited it to only 5% of the seed mix. Another consideration when looking at the species origin is to consider the site soils and if they've been significantly altered from their natural state. In general, introduced species tend to be better suited for sites that have elevated or higher levels of soil nutrients. And again, they can compete with weeds a little bit better. And here's a couple examples of that. On the left, we have, this was a pasture site, an irrigated pasture site that was grazed for about 40 years. And we know that the site had increased organic matter, it had increased nutrients on it, and there were weeds present on the site. So we, as part of the wetland enhancement project, we wanted to seed a diverse mix of species, and we included a mix that was half native species and half introduced species as a way to increase the diversity, but also have some competition with the weed species that were present on the site. And we had pretty good establishment and really equal representation of the natives and the introduced species established. And then on the right here, we have a site in southwestern Montana where it was native soils that were not altered really in any way. This was a temporary project where the native soils were removed and then regraded onto the site. And the native species that are adapted to lower nutrient sites were reseeded onto the site. And it was an all native species mix, a diverse mix, and it established really well on the site. Another thing to consider when developing our seed mixes is to include a variety of growth habits. And by that I mean that plant communities, they have a natural mix of different life forms on the site. So life forms would include our grasses, our forbs, legumes, and sometimes even shrubs in our seeding. Also, plant communities and ecological sites usually have a mix of growth forms. And our growth forms would be having bunch grasses on the site, having sod forming grasses, mix up shallow or deep rooted species. So consider designing a mix with species that have a variety of life forms and growth forms. Because a mix of species with different forms, it'll occupy more niches on the site. It can use resources more completely on the site. And a lot of times you'll get not only a more diverse site, but more biomass production and more site stability. Some other things to consider when developing a seed mix are the seed characteristics. And those would be the seed size, seed physical characteristics, and if the seed needs to go through a cold stratification period. So the first thing to be aware of is that different size seeds in a seed mix need to be compatible. So if you have a seed mix and you have a very large seed like a sunflower and you want to seed it with another seed like a prairie coneflower that has a very small seed, you need to be aware that you're including species that might need to be seeded at a different depth. So a real large seed might be seeded at 1 inch deep, maybe even 1.5 inches deep, where this seed needs to be planted only 1/4 inch deep or it won't establish well. So just being aware and trying to design a seed mix that has species that would be seeded at approximately the same depth is important. If you can seed species like this together, if you have equipment that can accommodate that, for example, you might seed the majority of your seed mix using a drill and planting it to 1 inch deep. And then you might include your small seed in another seed box and just unhook those tubes while you're seeding and let it just dribble on the ground behind your seeder. And you could hook up a chain harrow behind your seeder and just let that harrow lightly incorporate that small seed into the soil. Another thing to consider is if your seed has physical characteristics, like if it's fluffy or it has awns, like this blanket flower seed pictured here. And if it does have characteristics like that, you might want to use a seed carrier like rice hulls or corn grit that'll help improve the flow of the drill and give you better control over the seeding rate. And finally, we want to make sure that our species that we have in the mix are compatible with the timing that we want to seed the mix. So a lot of our native forbs are going to require a cold stratification period in order to germinate. And those species will have to be planted in the fall, not in the spring, in order to germinate. So you need to make sure as you're selecting and designing the mixes that you've included species that are compatible with the timing that they're seeded. Some other considerations when developing a seed mix are the number of species we have in the mix and the seed cost and availability. And we'll get into both of those here. Some people still seed a single species mix, and there's some benefits and disadvantages of having a single species mix. One of the advantages might be that it's easier to manage for hay or for silage production, especially if you're cutting it. If you had a mixture of species that established at different stages throughout the growing season, it can make cutting a little bit more difficult. Another benefit of having a single species mix might be that you could use a herbicide with it to control weeds. So again, a pure stand might be a good way to control your weeds before you put in longer lived, more diverse seed mix. But some drawbacks to having a single species mix, first of all, if you seed maybe an all legume mix, you could have issues with bloat. Also, a single species mix can really tend to overprescribe familiar species. And I'll just use the example of crested wheatgrass. Crested wheatgrass in the past, it was a great spring pasture plant, but nowadays it's really not considered as good of a choice for habitat. It tends to form monocultures, and it doesn't have the resiliency or soil health benefits that some of our diverse mixes have. So in general, you're primarily going to be seeding diverse species seed mixes, and there's a lot of different benefits and advantages of having a diverse mix. First of all, a diverse mix can enhance your seeding success. So having the mix of species, each species is going to respond a little bit different to each year's weather patterns. And there's also going to be some slight diversity in the soils or ecological sites within a planting site. So having a diverse mix it'll better be able to handle the slight environmental variations you have on the site. Also, diverse species mixes increase the amount of beneficial insects that you'd have on the site, so the insects and parasites, and this could be beneficial for providing natural pest control. Having a diverse mix can also help extend your grazing season and improve wildlife habitat and diversity, because that diversity is going to provide different plant structure and different food resources. Sites that are more diverse also are sites that are more productive. It seems a little counterintuitive, but when you have more species on the site, those species can utilize the resources more completely in time and space. And so you're creating plant communities that have more above ground biomass. They provide more protection, direct protection of the soil. They're also tend to be more resistant to weed invasion, and they provide a more stable site in that they don't change over their species as often as a less diverse site. Diversity is also important for improving soil health. And finally, a lot of it is aesthetics. Diverse sites are aesthetically pleasing to look at. So how diverse is diverse? I've seen a lot of seed mixes be developed where you have 20 different species in the seed mix. But some of the research and monitoring has shown that when you plant more species in a mix, you tend to only get about 5 to 9 species that usually establish. And seed mixes that were within 10 species or a little less had a greater proportion of all of the species establish. So kind of a rule of thumb for developing seed mixes is to be somewhere between 5 and 10 species. The minimum is 5 because we want to gain the advantages of a diverse mix, but I would say limit it to 10 so that we're not creating between species competition for getting established. Another consideration when developing your seed mix is the cost and availability of the seed. And this is a real world cost when you're working with a producer who's within a budget, and the cost needs to be acceptable to the landowner for what they want to achieve on the property. So I would encourage you to contact your local seed vendor and get the current costs of the seed and ask what quantities of that seed are available, and realize that the seed cost is going to change with demand and from year to year. So, for example, if you have a large rangeland wildfire year, your demand for species is going to go up and your price for those species is going to go up. I also want you to understand that sometimes small changes in the percentage or composition of a seed mix are going to have effects on the cost. And I want to illustrate that with this example and hope that it's a way that you can think about how you can increase diversity on a site without really increasing a lot of the seed cost overall. And in this example, I'm just picking Western Yarrow, Prairie Coneflower, and Purple Coneflower. I'm including them all in a mix at about 10% of the mix, or aiming for approximately 2 seeds per square foot. And the important part here is that these seeds all have very different number of seeds per pound. So 3,600,000 or 128,000 seeds per pound. Okay, so this is the hypothetical part of this example. I've just made up the seed cost of being $35 a pound for each of these species. And I've just done that to illustrate a point. If you want to seed a plant like Western Yarrow, a very small seed on a site, the seed vendor might come back with a cost that seems expensive. It might be $35 an acre, it might be $70 an acre. But to include that species in the mix at 10%, we're really only looking at about $1 per acre cost. If you have a medium-sized seed of about 600 seeds per pound and you had the same cost for that seed, you're looking at about $5 to $6 an acre for that species. So depending on what program you're in and the seed cost price that you're looking for with your producer, again, adding diversity might not be very expensive on a site. And as you increase in the seed size and increase in the cost, that's where you're going to start seeing more cost per pound, per acre to include it in the seed mix, but hopefully it's not prohibitive or you could adjust this down to a 5% of the seed mix and still get, work with your producer to be within the range of the acceptable price that is going to work with their budget and the program they're in, but that can help maximize the diversity of the site. And I've included a couple resources here that you can go to look for seed vendors in your area. Okay, I want to switch gears now and talk about where you can find a lot of the information that we're discussing today, the information that you're going to need for developing your seed mix. And a lot of those are going to be found in our technical notes and the plant guides or the plants database, and in our seed calculators that we've developed. So the tech notes, first of all, they're going to be found in Photog in section 1. They're also found on the Montana, Wyoming Plant Materials website and our national website. And I want to get into a little bit more of the information you're going to find in those tech notes and plant guides. When you go to our tech notes or plant guides, there's going to be really a wealth of information there on the life cycle of the plant, the precipitation range, adaptation to the soils, much more information. And as beginner planners, and just as you're getting familiar with this information, I really encourage you to download some of our plant guides and tech notes and become acquainted with the type of information that's available. And this is an example of the information you're going to find in our plant guides. You're going to find information on the soils where the plant is best suited, and also soils that it can also be found on or maybe tolerate. There's going to be information on its tolerance to cold, shade, fire. Also, for a lot of our species, it's really important to know if they can withstand seasonal flooding and inundation. So there'll be information on that. And then the precip range. So the precip range where you'll find the species naturally. And then if you're using a variety, a seeded variety, the precip range where you can find that plant will really thrive in. Hopefully you're all familiar with the plants database. When you go to the USDA plants database and you pull up a plant profile, on the left-hand side towards the bottom is where you're going to find the links to the plant guides that have the information that you can download. But I also want to point out this characteristics link. When you select this link, it's going to open up a whole nother tab that has quite a bit of information on it, on the plant's morphology, its physiology. There's going to be information on the growth requirements, site suitability, and I just can't emphasize enough how important it is, especially as a new planner, to look at this information. You save some of these plant guides on your computer, use them as references. I know that every time I go back to these materials, I learn new information about a species. So I'm really encouraging you to look through these resources. Another resource we have available in Montana and Wyoming are our seed calculators, which are available through the conservation practices in Photog. And when you go to those sites, you'll download the seed calculator, and on the data tab, you're going to find information listed by species. That includes the minimum precip range, the life form, the life cycle, growth form, origin, salinity tolerance, soil that it's adapted to, preferred seeding depth, and more. So this is really just meant to be a quick reference as you're designing your seed mix and looking for compatibility of species. But if you want more thorough information, continue to go to the plant guides and tech notes. We've been talking a lot today about a lot of different things you need to consider while you're developing a seed mix. the resource concerns, the objectives, the compatibility of different species and how easy they establish, seed characteristics, and more. And I know that it can be a little bit overwhelming, but with practice, it's really not that difficult, and it can also be a fun exercise. So I thought what we would do today is go through a couple seed mix examples and just think, we'll go through the thought process that I go through when I'm putting together a seed mix, and hopefully that'll help illustrate how we're trying to take all of these different things into consideration. So our first example is that we want to develop a mix that can be suitable for erosion control and wildlife habitat on a shallow, loamy soil in a rangeland situation. And we're in the 10 to 14 inch precip zone of MLRA 44A. So some of the first things I key into here is that I'm on a rangeland setting. So I'm thinking immediately that native species for the site. And I know that I can go to my web soil survey and my ecological site description to find species that are going to be adapted to that site. And I also want to look at not just what species are adapted, but what is the relative percentages of those species. It'll help me determine what proportion I'm going to include each of those species in the seed mix. Okay, and I've also, in this example, highlighted that we want to have erosion control and wildlife habitat as some of our resource concerns and objectives on the site. So immediately for erosion control, I'm thinking of those characteristics of plants that are going to be fast establishing. Probably want some rhizomatous species in there to hold the soil. Also species like a bunch grass that's going to have good above ground cover to provide the soil cover. And then for wildlife habitat, this would be a good time to follow up with the landowner and ask what type of wildlife they're planning for, because habitat for a sage grouse might be different than habitat that you're developing for elk. So know what wildlife species you're working with, and then select species that provide food and forage and shelter and structure for that species. And this is what I came up with for the seed mix. And I'm just going to point out a few things that I considered as putting together this mix. First of all, I've got 7 different species here. So I'm in that target range of I want 5 to 10 species in my mix. I've included a short-lived perennial, slender wheatgrass, because I know I want erosion control. So this is a real fast establishing species. And because I am using it with longer lived, slower established species, I've included it at only 5% of the seed mix, so it's not going to interfere with the development of other species. I've also included a mix of different life forms. So I have some forbs here, and the rest are grasses. I have included a diversity of different life growth forms, So life forms are grasses and forbs. Growth forms are bunch grasses versus sod forming grasses. And then as far as the origin, I used all native species because we're in a rangeland setting. I used species that are compatible to the ecological site, which would be adapted to the wildlife and the wildlife diversity on the site. I want to go through one more example before we wrap up, and this example, we're designing a seed mix that would be suitable for a flood irrigated pasture. It's a loamy soil in a rangeland setting. It's 10 to 14 inches in the precip zone of MLRA 34A. And this landowner, it was irrigated pasture, and it's also important for upland bird habitat. So some of the first things I'm thinking about, again, it's an irrigated pasture. So I might be using a mix of both native and introduced species. And I want to make sure that particularly for the introduced species where you can't go to your ecological site description and look at its adaptability. You want to go to your tech notes and plant guides and make sure that that species is going to be adapted to the soil properties and the site characteristics. I want to avoid mixing different palatability of species on the site. I want to consider the season of use for grazing with the species phenology. And also, as I mentioned, I want to consider using a mix of both native and introduced species. So this is the hypothetical mix that we came up for the site. And this was a field planting, just a demonstration where we were testing things, testing these different species near Pinedale, Wyoming. Couple things I'll point out again, I'm within the 7 species, so within the range of the diversity that I want. I've chosen all perennial species. The life form that I've selected for this is mostly grasses and 1 forb, and the forb that we've picked is one that is highly nutritious for grazing and a low bloat forage species. We've included a couple species that provide good above ground biomass and nesting habitat for upland birds that are a concern. And I've also mixed up between the bunch grasses and the sod forming grasses, so the growth form again of the plant. With this site, we also included meadow brome, which is a 14-inch precip plant. So we're really on the border of what the natural precipitation range is in the area, but we wanted to test this on site because we are flood irrigating it and because this was a field trial where we wanted to try different species on a site. So again, that's just some of the thought process I'm going through to address the resource concerns, the site characteristics, and different species characteristics that we would include in a seed mix. Our next webinar is going to be on seed quality and seeding calculations. And until then, I want to leave you with this list of resources that we have available. These are all links to the documents, and I would really encourage you to look at some of these tech notes and brochures that we have out because it'll give you information on the species and seeding rates, preferred forage, and much more information. So it's good to get familiar with the type of information that's out there as you're designing and developing seed mixes. And thank you for participating today.